Agenda-setting insight with our commentary on Reuters' Breakingviews. Today's top picks: there's more gloom from Lloyds, and why fracking shale could cause global geotremors. Peter Tarl-Larsen is with me to explain this. Let's start with Lloyds. I mean, it looks pretty grim for Lloyds out there. But it's not all grim, you say?
Well, that's, I think at first glance it does look pretty grim. But we think there are some potentially bright spots coming.
OK, let's go through what's grim first.
Well,
and if we have time, we'll get into it.
They're exposed to the UK economy. That in itself is not great. They've just set aside more money for mis-selling payment protection insurance. Remember, they started this whole thing last year, setting aside a big chunk of money for that. They're now setting aside more because the claims are proving even higher, so that's not great. The sale of their branches, which is being forced by the European Commission, is dragging on and taking time, and they're having trouble. Their preferred bidder is facing questions from the regulator, so that's not really done. And then and the UK economy is a bad backdrop against which to be a big retail bank. However, the bad debt performance is actually improving a bit, and the key question really for Lloyds is whether the regulatory picture can become clearer, and if they can get some clarity over the next few months on this disposal process, and also on kind of how much capital they're going to have to hold under the new rules in the UK, the new regulatory requements. Then,
how long is this going to take, though? I mean,
we don't quite know, but I mean, we think if they can get some clarity sort of over the summer, then there is actually the possibility they might be back to paying dividends towards the end of this year, which would be a big sign, because if you've been a Lloyds investor, you've had no dividends really since the crisis, and so that would be a big step for them in terms of their recovery. Bear in mind also that if you're an investor in Lloyds and you've been holding on this long, you're holding on to it for value, and ultimately because you think, not because this thing is going to grow at 10-15% a year, but because you think you're going to get a dividend stream out of it. So if they can take a step in that direction, that would actually be a positive sign.
Okay. Fracking shale. It's a small part of the big picture right now, but Edward had us, and it's taking this extremely seriously, clearly. And I pick out a couple of things. 20% of US natural gas came from shale last year. Yeah. The IEA says that shale will account for 10% of global supplies by 2035. I mean, these are very significant numbers.
They are, yeah, and actually, and you can say 20% in the US is only 3% of global gas supply or something like that. So at the margin, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. But it has an impact for two reasons. First of all, it affects the price, because the price tends to be affected by a marginal effect. But secondly, also, it affects the whole sort of the geopolitical dynamics. We're moving towards a situation where the US could conceivably be sort of energy independent at some point in the foreseeable future. That's a huge shift from the situation we've been in for the past century or so. And then you can also you can make similar arguments a bit further out, obviously, because we're not as far advanced here. But you could say, well, if Europe were able to develop something similar, it would become less dependent on Russia. And if China were able to develop something similar, it would be less dependent on imports.
And it's Poland, isn't it? That's the potentially the biggest producer of shale gas in Europe.
Right, and then what does that do to the dynamic of Poland versus the West, and what does it do in terms of Russia and the gas exports? I mean, these things will play out over time, but it does quite subtly but quite significantly shift the sort of geopolitical balance, and I think people are only just beginning to get their heads around what that means.
Okay, Peter, many thanks. That's it for now. For more agenda-setting insight, watch our US Breakingviews show every day, 12:30 Eastern, 17:30 London time. I'm Axel Threlfall. This is Reuters.